the summer of 484, the most powerful man between Rome and China rode east into a country he could barely see on his own maps. His name was Peroz, the King of Kings, Lord of the Sasanian Empire, the same Persia that had fought Rome to a standstill for the better part of 2 centuries. Behind him moved an army that some sources put near 100,000, heavy cavalry sheathed in iron, the finest soldiers of the age. He had come to settle a problem on his eastern frontier, where a people out of the high country had taken his richest provinces and humiliated him twice. This was the 3rd campaign, and he meant it to be the last. He never saw the trap. According to the old accounts, the ground in front of his charging cavalry had been opened, a deep ditch cut across their line and covered over to look like solid earth, and the horsemen rode into it at a gallop. When the dust settled, the army of the King of Kings had ceased to exist, and Peroz himself, ruler of an empire 2.5 centuries old, lay dead in the dirt of a country whose name his own scribes could barely spell. Persia would spend the next 50 years paying these people simply to leave it alone. We have their coins, and we can still read the writing on them. We have the faces of their kings, pressed into silver, and yet we cannot tell you for certain what language they spoke, or where on this earth they first came from. They were called the White Huns. The hardest thing about the Hephthalites is that we are not even certain what to call them. The Greeks wrote Hephthalites, the Persians said Hyatala, the Indians knew them as the Hunas, and the Chinese chronicles set them down as Yetta. When every neighbor reaches for a different word, it usually means none of them really understood who these people were. On their own coins, they seem to call themselves something close to Ebo Dalo, and that fragment is about as near as we will ever get to a name they chose for themselves. The label that stuck, White Huns, comes from a single Roman writer. Procopius, in the 6th century, called them Huns in fact as well as in name, but added that they mixed with no other Huns he had heard of, and were the only branch with pale skin and faces that were not, in his words, ugly. Then he wrote something stranger. These people did not wander. They had a king, they kept laws, they lived in towns and stayed in one place, and they buried their dead with care. That is not the Hun of the European nightmare, not Attila, but something else entirely, wearing a borrowed name. There is one detail you will not unsee once you notice it. On their coins, the kings have heads that look wrong, long and tapered, the whole skull drawn back from the brow into a point. That was deliberate, the head bound in infancy so the growing bone took the shape. Some scholars read in it an old link to peoples who had drifted west out of the deep heart of Asia centuries earlier. Others say it was only a fashion. That argument has run for 100 years without resolution, which leaves the uncomfortable center of the whole subject. Were they Iranian-speaking, Turkic in origin, or a confederation, one ruling clan seated on top of many other peoples? Serious historians have defended all 3 with real evidence, and none has won. About all we can safely say is that by the time they ruled in Bactria, they wrote in the local Bactrian script, because they had arrived without a script of their own and simply took up the one already there, an empire that broke kingdoms, and we cannot even name its mother tongue. Their heartland was Tokharistan, the old Bactria, the country on the northern flank of the Hindu Kush, today split between northeast Afghanistan and the south of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. It was a land of river valleys and walled cities, threaded by caravan roads that had carried silk and silver for 500 years before they arrived. They were not even the first power to come down off the steppe into it. Before them came the Kittites, another of these Hun peoples, and it was the Kittites whom the Hephthalites broke around the year 450 to take their place. Then they did the thing that made them rich. They sat down on the crossroads. From Bactria they pushed east into the Tarim Basin, west into Sogdiana, the country of the merchants we followed last time, and south through the passes toward India, taxing the caravans and holding the roads. The same Silk Road that had made the Sogdians wealthy now carried its tribute up to a court whose name we can barely pronounce. By the second half of the 5th century, they were the dominant power in the center of the continent, and to the west of them sat the oldest and proudest empire in the region, Sasanian Persia, which had decided these newcomers were a problem to be solved. It was a costly decision. The Sasanians were no soft target. They had been bleeding Rome for centuries, and their kings ruled as the King of Kings, by the favor of fire and of God. When Peroz took that throne in 459, he turned east, toward the Hephthalites, and over the following years he went at them 3 times. The first campaign ended with him a prisoner, forced to buy his freedom by handing over his son as a hostage and promising a tribute he could not really afford. That son, a boy named Kavad, would grow up among the very people who had captured him. Hold on to that. The second campaign failed too. Then came 484, the treacherous ground outside Herat, and the end of both his army and his life. A word about that ditch. The story of the concealed trench comes mostly from Procopius, writing far away, and many modern historians doubt it, because a clever trap story is exactly what a beaten side tells afterwards to save its pride. Trench or open defeat, the outcome was the same. Persia's king lay dead, and his eastern provinces, the rich lands of Khorasan, were gone. Of everything in this episode, what comes next is the most certain and the most extraordinary. For roughly 50 years, the Sasanian Empire, the superpower of its world, paid the Hephthalites to leave it in peace, becoming the junior partner of a people it could not even classify. And then it turned stranger. That hostage prince, Kavad, came back. When he lost his throne in a Persian civil war, he fled east to his former captors, who gave him a bride from their royal house and an army, and he rode back into Persia and took his crown by force with Hephthalite cavalry at his side. So the King of Kings of Persia owed his very throne to the White Huns, and for 2 generations the proudest empire in the region lived in the shadow of a people whose language we have lost completely. So how do we know any of this, if they left almost nothing in writing? We know it the way you know a stranger who left behind only what was in his pockets. We know it from money. The Hephthalites minted coins by the thousand, and often they did not even strike their own. They took Persian coins and stamped their marks straight over them, driving their symbols across the face of the King of Kings. There is one image scholars return to again and again, a Hephthalites ruler wearing the crown of Peroz himself, the very king they had killed, now set on their own kings and spent across half a continent. The legends on those coins are in the Bactrian script, and we can read them. That is the strange gift these people left. We can read their money, hold the faces of their kings in the palm of a hand, recite a few of their names, but the script is borrowed and the language behind it is mostly the local one, so the voice they actually used at home stays silent. They are, in the most literal sense, a people we can see clearly and cannot hear at all. While Persia handed over its silver in the west, another world was breaking in the south. In the late 5th and early 6th centuries, a wave of these same Hunnic peoples poured down through the passes into northern India, into the Gupta Empire, one of the great ages of Indian art and learning. The Indians called them the Hunas, and 2 of their kings come down to us by name, Toramana, and after him his son Mihirakala, whose name survives in the sources almost as a byword for cruelty, a wrecker of monasteries, and a persecutor of monks. The Gupta order, already strained, buckled under the pressure, and a golden age dimmed. Here I have to be careful, because this is where the legend usually goes wrong. For a long time everyone assumed the Huns who broke Persia and the Huns who broke India were one people. The newer scholarship is more cautious. The group that invaded India, the Aelkon, looks more like a related branch, cousins out of the same Hunnic world riding the same wave, than the identical court that killed Peroz, and the precise relationship is still argued over. But the shape is clear enough. Within a few decades, a cluster of peoples out of the high center of Asia put the fear of God into Persia and helped bring down one of India's great dynasties. 2 of the oldest powers on earth, shaken within a single lifetime by men whose origins we still cannot pin down. Empires built on holding the road live and die by who else turns up on it. And in the middle of the 6th century, something larger came down the step behind them. The Göktürks, the first great Turkic empire, burst out of the east and swept west across the grasslands, and in Persia a new king of kings was watching. Khosrow I, called Anushirvan, the grandson of Peroz, heir to the man who died at Herat. Khosrow did the one thing the Hephthalites could not survive. He allied with the people coming up behind them. The empire that had owned the Crossroads for 100 years was now caught between Persia in the west and the Göktürk Kaganistami in the north. The end came around 557 to 560 near Bukhara, on a field the sources call Gol-Zarriun. The Hephthalite king, Gadfar, lost, and his empire did not retreat and regroup so much as come apart, splintering into small principalities, minor lords each clinging to a single valley, paying their taxes now to a Turk in the north or a Persian in the south. The two victors then did what victors do. They turned on each other and divided the corpse, drawing a border down the middle of the old Hephthalite world along the river Oxus, the Amu Darya, the Turks to the north, Persia to the south. The empire that had once sat at the center of everything became the seam between two others. After that, they thin out of the record. A few lines of Hephthalite princes cling on in the Afghan valleys for another century, while others are absorbed, married in, folded into the towns and bloodlines of the peoples who came after, woven so completely into the ancestry of the region that you can no longer say where they end and the next people begin. One last thread. In the years right after they fell, a Sogdian merchant named Mahni-Ah, from exactly the people we followed last time, talked the new Turkic masters into sending an embassy all the way to Constantinople to open the silk trade with Rome. The road the Hephthalites had held was already passing into other hands, and the Sogdians, as ever, were already on it. So this is what an empire amounts to, stripped all the way down. They killed the king of kings of Persia. They made the superpower of their age pay tribute for 50 years. They set a Persian crown back on the head of a prince who owed them his life. They shook the golden age of Gupta India. They held the richest road on earth. And they left us no book, no name we can be sure of, no language we can name, nothing of the voice at all, only the face, stamped in silver with that long, strange skull, looking past us at something we will never see. History did not forget them because they were small. It forgot them because they were quiet, because the one thing they never thought to write down was themselves. You have already seen how this corner of the world ended once, in the ashes of Otrar, in 1219. Next time, we go back to how that began. We move forward from here only a few generations, to an empire that ruled from the Caspian to the Indus, whose rulers called themselves heirs of the ancient Shahs, and whose cities were among the richest on earth, until one caravan was robbed, one envoy was killed, and a man on the far side of the desert decided this empire would not merely fall, but be wiped from the map. They were the Khwarazmshahs. Next time, we open that file.